Thank you for watching this video, a brief overview of serving English learners in Wisconsin. My name is Rosa Maria Lorson. You can see my contact information below. Feel free to contact me with any questions you may have. Our agenda. First, I will introduce a little bit about myself. I will give you a definition for the term English learner. Also give you a timeline to give you some historical context about the rights of English learners. Also give you an overview of the responsibilities of school personnel and school districts. And then some financial information, namely Title III and Bilingual-Bicultural aid. I have personal experience as an English learner. I didn't start learning English until I was 5 years old. We spoke primarily Spanish in our home. I attended bilingual school starting in 1st grade through 8th grade. That was all throughout the 80s. And high school was just mainstream English. In 2005, I started teaching in Milwaukee Public Schools in a bilingual program. And I was an ESL teacher in Janesville for a couple of years before I became the program manager for English learners in Beloit. Currently, I am a bilingual reading specialist in the Delavendarian School District. There are two key factors in determining who should be identified as an English learner. Students ages 3 through 21 who are enrolled in elementary or secondary school. If they come from an environment where a language other than English has had a significant impact on their English proficiency level, so that's one factor, okay? And if this fact that they have an impact on their proficiency level in English gives them difficulty in reading, writing, speaking, or understanding English, that it would be significant enough or sufficient enough that they would not be able to meet the state academic standards or successfully achieve in classrooms where the language of instruction is English, and also the opportunity to participate fully in society. The U.S. Department of Education gives a much longer definition here. I will post this link below. Here is a timeline. Before the 1920s, bilingual education was more common. The large immigrant groups that would come over from Europe would maintain their home language. They would set up community schools where their home language was taught. But when World War I hit, that kind of put a halt to a lot of that. There was a huge anti-immigrant sentiment, so that's kind of in the 1920s became the beginning of English-only type of ideas. In 1923, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in Meyer versus Nebraska that schools can offer instruction in any language other than English. This came about because a Lutheran pastor was reading a Bible verse in German to his students, and he was charged for not teaching the students English. And the U.S. Supreme Court found that in favor of the Lutheran pastor. In 1947, the U.S. Court of Appeals struck down segregation in Orange County, California. Before that time, Mexican American students were segregated from non-Mexican American students. And what parents were finding is that the students were not learning English, and they determined that it was because they were never exposed to native English speakers. So that's the reason why they were integrated. This was one of the courts that was used to support Brown versus Board. So it is a fairly important court case. In 1963, with the refugees coming from Cuba, the first two-way immersion was set up in Miami. So this meant that Spanish speakers and non-Spanish speakers were put in the same school to learn both Spanish and English. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act happened. And in 1968 was the beginning of the Bilingual Education Act. Prior to 1968, there were bilingual programs happening. However, there was no funding. So that year, funding started happening for these programs. In 1974, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in Lau versus Nichols that English learners had to have barriers to their education removed. What was happening is students who were Chinese speakers were placed in classrooms in a sink or swim situation where they received the same books, the same instruction in English, and no supports, and the students were failing because of their limited English. In 1981, in Castañeda versus Pickard, down in Texas, it was decided that programming for English learners had to be research-based. Schools and school districts had to provide teachers that were knowledgeable in providing this research-based programming, and if the programming is not working, they have to fix it. They have to try something new. So that's called the Castañeda test. And that is a requirement from the federal government that school districts do have to do that. In 1982, Plyler versus Doe decided that undocumented children have the right to a free and appropriate public education, just like any other child in this country. Prior to 1982, there have been cases and situations where immigration officers would come into schools and pluck children out of their seats and take them to detention centers. So that doesn't happen anymore. In 2001, No Child Left Behind ended the Bilingual Education Act very quietly. Nobody even realized that it had happened, and it was replaced with Title III, which is called the Language Instruction for Limited English Proficient and Immigrant Students. So that really changed things for the bilingual education. Prior to that time, there was a lot more English-only type of practices across the country. And in 2015, things changed again under Every Student Succeeds Act. One of the biggest changes is that language proficiency, attaining English, and also exiting English learner programs is an accountability piece in Title I. In general, school districts and schools have the following responsibilities. 1. Any student who might be a potential English learner or a student who is a migrant student, so a student that travels from state to state with the family or even by themselves, looking for temporary seasonal work or farm work, could be considered a migrant student. Usually the students come from Texas, Florida, California, Southwest United States up to the Midwest, or even further north for seasonal farm work in most cases. Immigrant students being students who were born in another country and have been in the United States for less than 3 years. And then refugee students as well, who come from situations where it might be a war-torn country or extreme poverty or some other dangerous situation. So if you have students that potentially could fit in those categories, the school and school district are required to assess them to decide whether or not they would be identified as an English learner. After they are identified, you provide a language assistance program, and that varies district to district. In Wisconsin, the statutes are very clear as to what needs to be provided, but at the federal level, there has to be a language assistance program for Title III requirements. In addition to that, you need to provide the staff to support the language assistance program. That can be done through various ways. You could have duly certified staff. You could do training for staff, but that's at a general federal level. Wisconsin has different requirements. Students must be given equal opportunities in extracurricular activities and in co-curricular activities, and avoid unnecessary segregation. Now, there have been situations where bilingual programs, one-way immersion type programs, are seen as segregation. However, the way that it was explained to me is that if it's not an indefinite plan where they, where they do spend some time during the day with peers that are not English learners, that it's not a forever type of situation, that it should be fine, that it's not considered unnecessary segregation. So the rate of English learners who may have a special ed need is seen as, should be the same rate as students who have a special ed need in the general English, native English speaking population. So the requirement is that students who may have a disability, that they be located, sometimes done through things like Child Find, and that they be evaluated in a timely manner. And while doing all those things, that the student's language needs would be considered. So testing in their own language, taking into account their language development needs, things like that. Even students whose parents deny services and don't want language assistance programming, the school and school districts still need to meet their needs regardless of that. They might not be enrolled in language assistance programming, however, something needs to be provided, whether it be training for the classroom teacher, whether it be support to the family, and it doesn't have to be direct, but there has to be something in place to help that student. Schools and school districts are required to monitor and evaluate English proficiency, as well as academic grade level content. So in the state of Wisconsin, we have the access test and we also have the forward exam, so those two would count. And then once students do reach proficiency in English, the school and school district are required to monitor these students to make sure that they are transitioning into the mainstream education without needing support. And if they do need support, they can always be invited back into the language assistance program and newly identified as an English learner. The school and school district are also supposed to evaluate the effectiveness of their language assistance program and see whether or not their students are exiting in a reasonable amount of time. That reasonable amount of time through research has been seen as little as 5 to 7 years and up to 7 to 10 years. Also, schools and school districts need to engage families through various ways. That includes translating things or using simpler English language to communicate. In Wisconsin, we are a bilingual bicultural education state, so that means that we are required to provide this to our students if the following conditions are met. There has to be a certain number of students in the same grade cluster from the same language group. And these students should be identified as English learners, and that would require the school or the school district to offer a bilingual bicultural program taught by a bilingual teacher. So if you have 10 students in grades kindergarten through third, not in each grade level, all together, or 20 students in grades 4 through 8, or 20 students in grades 9 through 12 in a school, you are required to provide a bilingual bicultural education program. Some school districts decide that they are going to combine the students across the district in these grade clusters. So if you have 3 schools and you have 3 kids in one school, 3 kids in another school, and then 4 kids in another school, you could combine all those students and create a bilingual program. That is an option as well. In Wisconsin, we have 50,000 English learners, so about 5.8% of the total student population. 80% of these English learners are Spanish speakers. Just to go back here for a second, I was looking on the annual report of licenses given out to educators, and in 2016-17, only 40 teachers were certified in English as a second language. The report didn't give how many bilingual teachers were certified, but once you are bilingual certified, you are also ESL certified. So the idea is that some of those ESL teachers or ESL certified teachers, a few of them may also be bilingual certified. So obviously fewer than 40, and I would say probably fewer than half. So maybe, I don't know, if I had to guess, 15 to 20 in 2016 were certified bilingual education. And when you have 40,000 Spanish speakers across the state, bilingual teachers are, there is a severe shortage for teachers that have these certifications. There is some funding to support English learner programs. However, this funding should not be used until everything else is exhausted. So your general fund, your Title I fund, and then that's when you can start looking at Title III and bilingual-bicultural aid. So the amount that had been given out last year was about $117 per English learner student. That count, the count of how many students are in your school district is based on how many completed access tests you have. Completed meaning all 4 parts were completed by the same, by the same student. So sometimes what ends up happening is that the student doesn't click on the last question, or they don't finish the speaking test, or something happens, and then you spend all that time giving the student the access test, and then they don't generate any Title III dollars, which, we shouldn't be looking at them as Title III dollars, but it is something that can be used to support our students. In addition to the Title III Part A English Language Acquisition funding, there are also additional funds for immigrant, migrant, and refugee students. In the state of Wisconsin, over $8 million of the state budget was set aside for reimbursement to school districts that have bilingual programs, for supplies, and then for some reimbursement for salary and benefits. So the rate is about 8 to 9% of the bilingual certified teacher's salary and benefits. And that is only for the percentage of time that they work with English learners. So if you have a duly certified teacher and part of their day is spent working with the general education program, let's say they are doing a class, like an English language arts class for part of the day, and then the other part of their day they're working with English learners, you can only claim the time that they're working with English learners, where the majority of their class is ELL. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about where your bilingual certified staff are going, because that does affect the amount of money that the school district can request back from the state. In addition to that, $250,000 from this bilingual-bicultural aid is set aside, and it is split equitably among school districts that have an English learner population of more than 15%. In the state of Wisconsin, there are about 89 school districts out of however many we have a lot, that have some sort of bilingual programs. But the top 3 that have the highest percentage in order are Abbotsford, Delavan Darien, and then Beloit. So these three school districts at some point or almost every year will get some of this $250,000 um, because there's fewer than 10 and probably right around like 5 to 7 school districts in the entire state that have more than 15% of their student population identified as English learners. The other funding source is a transfer of service, so any student that comes to the school district out of state, out of country, or from another school district does qualify for this transfer of service if the school district is spending additional funds. So if they need new supplies, if they need new teacher aid or teacher time, that could be uh, turned in, and then the state would take it from the other school district if they came from within Wisconsin to give you more funding. Okay, well, thank you. That was it in a nutshell. Please fill out the feedback form at the link, and I will post that below as well. I really appreciate you sitting through this presentation, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you.